Can you take us inside his mind, his reasoning as to why he would say that about you?
I don't know why, other than I think that there is you'll find this as you both continue on your career. As you start working with more and more senior leaders, there really is a strong draw. This is a culmination of many senior leaders. They've done 3 decades and sometimes 4 decades in uniform. They've reached a very senior position as a 3-star or a 4-star. And you are used to defining your own kind of perspective, your legacy, your reality. I always kind of joke it's a little bit like Steve Jobs at Apple. People said he had a reality distortion field. And not that necessarily that existed around Mattis, but more along the lines that he just had this expectation. He will set the history of his legacy. So I think that, anytime you have someone junior to you come out and you can't control what they're going to say, that's probably a little bit alarming. I would say, obviously, if a junior officer or a junior sailor from my command and VFA 195 said, hey, I'm going to write a book about my experience in a fighter squadron, and I'm going to talk about you. It's like, great, go after it. I've been a long time member of the U.S. Naval Institute. It's an open forum. It's about daring to read, think, write, and publish. So again, there's always going to be, individuals or naysayers who say you should never have touched this with a 10-foot pole. It kind of cuts against the grain of what we're used to in uniform service. Everything that happens behind closed doors always stays there. But I used as my guidepost Secretary Mattis and his own book project. I used Admiral Zumwalt, who wrote a phenomenal book called On Watch that just walks through, over the course of about 500 or 600 pages, a lot of his conversations with the president and others. So I think there's a long history of these kinds of works. And frankly, the last thing I'll leave you with is just the lessons learned. The fact that as a Top Gun instructor, as a fighter pilot, you knew that the most important part of any flight was the debrief, because that's where you can talk about some of the good things happen, but more importantly, you focus on the things where you can learn and grow and help those who come behind you. And that was the main purpose of the book and why I approached it the way I did.
But I think the difference with these admirals is that they're coming from a position where people want to hear about their experiences and analyses and opinions on national security, regardless of the private conversations that may or may not be revealed in their books. Whereas in your case, your book, some might argue, is only marketable because of those private conversations and that sensitive information that you reveal.
Well, look, I think if you start going too far down the line, all you're doing is highlighting a double standard. When I've looked at a lot of leaders who I've either met or respect, Admiral Bill McRaven, if you read Sea Stories, he's got a very riveting couple different sections and chapters where he talks about the takedown of Osama bin Laden and basically the blow by blow of what's happening behind the closed doors with Secretary Clinton and others. He's got another scene in a secure conference room in the Pentagon. So, yeah, they are who they are. I would also say that I think for memorializing history, for passing on those lessons learned, there's about, in this case, probably about 30 to 40% more of the military that's going to be in my position than will ever attain theirs. So being able to leave behind kind of that, pebbles on the path so that someone can say, okay, I've read Bus's book. I've seen the high points. I've seen the low points. I've seen what it's like and I've kind of experienced how it is to serve on a very high-powered senior staff with a lot of stress, with a lot of national level issues and international levels issues of significance. And if they find themselves in a role like that, serving on a staff or serving in a senior position, I suspect they'll feel better prepared because of it.
You're going to have a lot more O5s in the Navy than O10s, and these O5s can look at your book as a chance to see some lessons learned from who's gone before.
Yeah, it could be for anybody, right? So you could be in a business with 500 people in your middle management. And I think that, look, when I wrote the book, it was, like I said, I wanted to treat the material very well. I wanted to make sure that I was apolitical. I wanted to make sure I had a consistent approach. I reached out to a lot of admirals, generals, and even a former cabinet secretary to say, this is the project I've embarked on. How do I do this the right way? The way that will stand the test of time, the way that will preserve my honor and my dignity and my credibility. And got a lot of phenomenal feedback. A lot of people weighed in, and frankly, I took their advice because I think it's resulted in a much better project. It's not the way the press wants to characterize it as a tell-all. And I think they do that because it sounds salacious and it gets more people to grab the book. And I was never into that. That's why I've never referred to it that way. I've just always said it's a memoir of my experience serving alongside Secretary Mattis. It was an incredibly unique way to get to that position. And then while I was there, saw some just amazing things that I think a lot of people could benefit from. And so it just felt like it was a continuation of my service to say, well, here are those lessons learned. Here's what that looked like. Because I will tell you that you're right. When principals write books, you are going to get their perspective, their thoughts, but you're also getting their bumper sticker and their continued messaging. I refer to, for example, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, National Security Advisor during Nixon and Johnson, for example. And he wrote several books about his tenure, but the one I liked the most came from Walter Isaacson, who took that third-party approach and did a lot of research, a lot of studying, and said, okay, here's Kissinger, but this is the more unvarnished, what's really going on behind the scenes, both the good and the bad. And you know, I really thought that I gained a lot more from him than I did from Kissinger just telling me his sound bites.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned some of the reporting on your book has characterized it as a tell-all, and they want to focus on the juicy parts. Mm-hmm. You are a politically savvy person, you know, having spent time in D.C. I know you write in the book you're a political junkie. So you must have known that a lot of the attention paid to your book would focus on those juicy details. And you can even see how there could be opponents of President Trump who would want to cherry pick details from this to use as political ammunition. Were you concerned about that possibility at all? The possibility that what you've written here could actually be used to politicize the military further?
I was. Like I said, you know, it's interesting, and you're right on. People made hay with the $10 billion JEDI contract. The fact that it was widely reported that President Trump, you know, Mattis relays to us in a conversation that President Trump had called over and directed him to screw Amazon, which of course is not appropriate. Mm-hmm. And so I used it to highlight the ethical and legal way that Mattis led the department. I thought it was just a poignant, but it's basically 2 or 3 sentences in an entire book of like around 10,000 sentences. Mm-hmm. So you're right. They'll kind of pour through it to pull out the juiciest, most newsworthy tidbits. I knew to expect that. I tried to write the material responsibly in accordance because, of course, the book could be just filled with all sorts of stuff. There's a lot more that always goes on behind the scenes, but it was more important to write a really good book that'll stand the test of time. Yes, some people are going to pull a couple nuggets out here and there and want to use them, but the thing that has really made me happy is that I've had a lot of responses. In fact, the only negative response I've had is what you just read, the Secretary Mattis release. I've had a couple people say, you know, I'm on the fence. But I've had a lot of people say, you know, I was on the fence. I read your book, and I'm really glad I did because you made me feel incredibly comfortable with the way you treated it. It really wasn't what I was expecting. It's a lot better. And I think that's what's important is because as people engage, especially as men and women in uniform who are serving our country, even if they're just civil servants and not in uniform, as they read the book, as they talk about it with their friends, as we have conversations like I'm having with you right now, then I think that it helps to still those waters. And it'll stand the test of time, something that I could see people using down the road.
Chicago, the Windy City, the city of broad shoulders, the second city, is complicated.
Known for its legacies of segregation and political corruption, Chicago has a lot to grapple with.
On Chicagoland, we bring you conversations with activists, journalists, politicians, and others who are working to address these issues.
You can find Chicagoland wherever you listen to podcasts.
From University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts.
This is Chicagoland.
So one popular take on Mattis and the other retired generals who served in the Trump administration was that they would act as the adults in the room, a term that you even discuss in your book. Kind of people to help manage and stabilize the government, in contrast to a president who was inexperienced with government and tended to lead in a pretty unconventional way. You discussed this in your chapter, Adults in the Room, and we're wondering if you could describe how that dynamic played out from your point of view.
Yeah, and it's funny because you said I use the term adults in the room. One thing that I think underpins also this entire conversation, and something that's really important for everyone to always kind of keep in the back of their mind, is I did not write this from like a niche military-only press, only for military members, right? This was a book that was intended for a general audience, and I wanted to write it in such a way that, you know, my aunt in Toledo or the cousin in California who's never had an interaction with the military a day of their life could pick it up, read it, and then also you tuck in some really interesting, like juicy for me, like as a guy who likes national security, you know, like what's going on with Afghanistan? What's the war on terror? How did we create the national defense strategy? Things that people would normally never engage with. But if you have a couple things that brings them to the book and then they stay for that, you know, matinee that's got all the really good crunchy stuff, I've been amazed that people will stick with it that long. Back to your question about adults in the room, that was the colloquial term that the press had given them. And the one thing that I thought that really stood out was, when you're outside the bubble, and by the bubble, I mean outside the administration, outside that team, you have this perception that, there's adults in a room and every single one of them is like meeting in like a smoke-filled room to plot the course ahead. And that's really not the case. They're each running their own cabinet department, or in McMaster's case, he's running the National Security Council. And they had disagreements, and in the book I cover some disagreements that Secretary Mattis had with McMaster at various times, and the way they kind of rubbed on each other. And that's to me is such a great leadership lesson. It's an organizational philosophy and dynamics lesson about you may have this kind of greater good, and good does not mean you're blocking the president or you're blocking his policy decisions. Good means that you're providing him with well thought out opportunities. You're providing a path forward where you can say, Mr. President, I know you're saying you want to accomplish this. The way you've asked to do it is not, you're going to have a lot of issues down the road. What if you did it this other way? And that's stuff that you could do as a petty officer. It's stuff you could do as a midshipman. It's stuff you could be doing as a junior officer across any of the branches of service. We've all been there, where you have a leader who maybe fires from the hip, wants you to do something, and then you have to find a way to get them to the result that they want in the best possible way for you, the crew, and everybody else involved. So the adults in the room, they did work cooperatively together, but it was largely to provide the president with the best policy solutions and to make sure someone who has had no experience with governance and no experience in national security understood the ramifications of what he was asking for.
And do you think that approach ended up working out?
I think history's got to really weigh in more here, because there's so much disagreement right now, even like, well, if they left after somewhere between a year to 2 years, they quote unquote failed. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think they served a pivotal role at that moment in time where, again, you had a president who no military, national security, governance experience. He's got a wealth of knowledge in business, a wealth of knowledge in, I say entertainment loosely, but, he knows how to use mass media. He knows how to use communication tools. So he has some great strengths. He also has some areas where maybe he's got some blind spots. And I think that they served a really important role during that formative period for him.
So while that term adults in the room is often used to praise Secretary Mattis in a way, there's also been a criticism against him, especially from civil scholars, that as Secretary of Defense, he didn't seem to fully accept the fact that he was a civilian in a political role. Instead, it was pretty clear that he tried to remain apolitical, and he continued to think like a Marine Corps general. Based on what you saw, do you find that to be a true characterization, and did that kind of mindset affect his performance and effectiveness?
There's probably more nuance even than that, right? The way I like to characterize it is that when you're in positions of responsibility like Secretary Mattis was, and of course at my own level like I was and others, you're all really just actors on a stage playing the role the best you know how. So for Mattis, he knew that if you are incredibly vocal, if you are perceived as stepping into or stealing the limelight from this president, you're going to be out the door pretty quick. So, but of course, as I'm sure we'll get into, that had ramifications with the way he communicated or didn't communicate with the media, right? So we kind of shut down that part of the operation. So, it's a fascinating look at organizational just dynamics and philosophy and leadership in general, because when you bring in, for example, your chief of staff is a relatively recently retired one-star admiral, your senior military assistant is a two-star admiral, you've got a Marine Corps lieutenant colonel, a Navy commander, another Navy commander. I mean, it's a very Navy Marine Corps centric front office. You're going to get a certain flavor of how things operate that you would not have if you had more civilians. So Secretary Mattis, I think he relied on the skill sets he had developed over 43 years in the Marine Corps. And I think so. You always go back to your comfort zone. He brought in a lot of people he'd worked with before at CENTCOM, so he's going to get similar results to what he had there. It means you can move fast, but it also means you're going to leave some broken bodies in your wake, because we wanted to make change pretty quickly. And I think that the other aspect that you're hitting on with Civ Mill, you got to be careful who you surround yourself with, because he had two admirals as his chief of staff and as his senior military assistant. They basically took an XO-CO kind of mentality, where the chief of staff was the commanding officer, or at least operated up and out. And then you had your active duty two-star Navy admiral, who was in the role as basically the XO and driving all the different operations in the Pentagon and telling, more senior civilians what to do. And that's where people started getting their nose kind of twisted out of shape.
So I actually wanted to ask about that. So you write about in your book how he surrounded himself with all these military personnel in the front office, and you write about how